Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Tiger Bay. I'm Ed Childs. I'm your moderator today. It's my privilege to be here and to stand in for Greg Porges, who last we heard was somewhere in France. Little housekeeping to start off with. Please continue to enjoy your meals. 2011 members, you will be receiving your annual survey in the next week or two. Please take the time to fill it out. We had a very, very good response from this last year, and we are looking forward to your comments and critiques in the coming year, for the coming year. The 2012 annual dues notices have been sent, and we expect them to be paid promptly. And the applications for all of our guests today are on the table. And I'm just kidding about expecting to be paid promptly because I don't have anything to do with that. Next meeting will take place here Thursday, February 2nd. I want to remind you today that questions are open to members of Tiger Bay. So that's another great reason to join. It's not just about the lunch, folks. It's about the ability to ask a question here and fire some hardballs at these panelists that we have and future panels that we have up here. So please join. Please encourage your friends to join. Paid members in December, you don't want to ask any questions. Okay, so if you have joined for 2012, we encourage you to ask questions as well. If you're going to ask a question, please come to the microphone right here to my left. We may go a little bit long today. We've got a great topic, and we've got a great crowd. We're getting just a little bit of a late start because we wanted to set up for some overflow here. If you're going to leave, and you have to leave, please feel free to do so. Please leave quietly. If you're a member, you're welcome to take your pie with you. Non-members, please leave your pie on the table. Always with a little humor, Zukov, always with a little humor. That's a line from the original Manchurian Candidate. Today's topic is civility in politics. Is it an oxymoron, a utopian fantasy, or a lost art? At the end of the day, it very well may be a combination of all three. After all, politics has never been for the faint of heart. When power and position are being contested, the level of discourse can at times get more than a little pointed and personal. It just seems that today we live in a time when the humor and the wit of the put-down seems to be at an all-time low. The politician of today seems to too readily settle for mundane, predictable, and shallow name-calling. Too bad not only because of its divisive effect, but because in the desire to best their opponent, most resort to the quick and the easy rather than the thoughtful and the humorous. Our British cousins have long been considered masters of the witty put-down. Witness Prime Minister William Gladstone's quote after a heated exchange with his rival Benjamin Disraeli. "Sir, I feel you shall meet your death either on the gallows or from venereal disease." Disraeli replied, "I think that depends, my dear sir, on whether I embrace your principles or your mistress." History recorded no response. One can only imagine Mr. Gladstone was temporarily struck mute. Nor were such venom only dispensed by the male of the species. Here's the wife of one of England's prime ministers referring to one of her husband's staunchest critics, Winston Churchill, in words that still sting like a bee 100 years after they were first spoken. Mr. Churchill would kill his own mother just so he could use her skin to make a drum to beat his own praises. One could only imagine how the pundits of today would react to such a comment made by a member of either wing of the political spectrum. I can see Rush Limbaugh choking on his microphone. Mr. Churchill, on the other hand, was probably impressed by the creativity behind the remark, as he himself was universally acclaimed master of the art. He has left us with any number of rapier-like put-downs, like the time he referred to Prime Minister Clement Attlee as a sheep in sheep's clothing. Or again, as a modest man with much to be modest about. Or that Harold Wilson was going around the country stirring up apathy. And when he found himself once more at the receiving end of the acerbic comment from one of his rival's wives, when she told him that if he were her husband, she would poison his coffee, to which he replied, "And madam, if you were my wife, I would gladly drink it." On this side of the Atlantic, we've had our own share of colorful invective aimed at even some of the most highly esteemed members of our political pantheon. It's a shame that Benjamin Franklin had already passed away when William Cobbett commented on a likeness of Franklin that it was located in the grounds of the Pennsylvania State House as one of a crafty and lecherous old hypocrite whose very statue seems to gloat on the wenches as they walk by. Wouldn't we all love to have heard of Ben's reaction to that one? Or when the much admired and celebrated Henry Clay, with all the righteous indignation he could muster, declare, "I would rather be right than be president," to which the much more plain-spoken Andrew Jackson replied, "I wouldn't worry, you'll be neither." Not even the death of a president was considered to be out of bounds. When the news of President Coolidge had died, columnist Dorsey Parker inquired, "How can they tell?" Today's panel will hopefully enlighten us on this subject and hopefully give us some encouragement that in these perilous times our leaders can change course and begin to work together to face the serious issues that confront our nation. Our first speaker today will be the esteemed Congressman Dan Miller.
Thank you, Ed. And I think each of us have, 3 or 4 minutes to make some comments about this issue.
Absolutely.
And we'll have
Take
plenty
all the time you want.
Well, no. We need to have time for questions. Someone asking about oxymorons, and I was just thinking of one, Ed Childs and suit and tie. The issue of civility, I don't know if it's any different today than it was 50, 100, 200 years ago, as Ed talked about these situations. When you think about, Alexander Hamilton was killed in a duel. They had caning on the floor of Congress where people were being beaten up by another member of Congress. So civility is what's changed is the media. And I'm going to let Chris and some others talk about how television and radio, and especially the internet, has changed all that. When you get to the television, we all know there's only one fair and balanced news source anymore in television. But the fact is you have television shows that go different political persuasions. But what I want to talk about, and I'm going to bring up one issue and then everyone else can kind of bring up their issue, is that the people we elect in this country, we generally elect people that are more conservative or more liberal than the population is in general. Most elections are decided in primaries. The political parties have changed a lot over the past few decades. And so nowadays what we have these two political parties, one that could be considered a conservative party and one's a liberal party. Back in the 1960s and 70s, we used to have liberal Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller or Jacob Javits. Liberal Republicans an oxymoron now. And the same thing you can say about conservative Democrats is an oxymoron. You used to have Southern conservative Democrats within the party. Nowadays the Blue Dog Coalition in the House I think it's got 18 members. So the parties have changed so that one party is quite conservative and one party is quite liberal. Even though my Democrat friends may say, well, I'm not a liberal, but the fact is the parties are dominated by the extremes, I think, of the parties. And elections are decided in primaries. When I ran for Congress in 1992 and each of my successive re-elections, I never had to really worry about a Democratic opponent. This area was too Republican. My base was the Republican Party. And so for most members of county elected to the state legislature or the county commission, it's the Republican primary that makes the decision. And that's true nationally. You have 435 members in the House. There's probably only going to be about 50 competitive races in the country. And so if you get elected by a base voter, the people that participate in the primaries are the most conservative or the most liberal. That's who you've got to continue to appeal to. We can see that right now with the presidential election process for the Republicans. They're having to go to the right to get the nomination. They always say in the presidential race you have to run to the right or run to the left and then get to the center as fast as you can to win the general election. But when most elections are decided in the primaries, that's the base that you keep having to focus on. And I think that is a major contributor in addition to all these other issues. So I'm only going to bring up one issue, and then we'll open up for the others.
Thank you, Dan. Our next speaker will be Frank Alcock. Frank is Associate Professor of Political Science at New College.
Well, thanks for having me. I'd just like to make 3 points on the topic, and I'll try to do it briefly. First one might be the most important, and it's pretty straightforward. I think we live right now in a society that laments incivility, but modern political culture and the modern political system rewards it, and that is what it is. Some of the benefits from being confrontational, if not provocative, are you get noticed, certainly, by being confrontational and being provocative, and you also get a lot of support, often, as Dan said, from strong bases that like to see you flex your warrior bona fides. And that may seem a little bit tribal, but I think we're getting to a point where we do have a lot of political tribalism right now in the country. On the cost side, what usually happens to take care of uncivil behavior or incivil behavior, you get a lot of shaming and sanctioning. And I think the communities do that, tight-knit communities, and I think that might be part of the reason why you see less incivil behavior down at the local political level than you do up at the national political level. But right now there's not much of a political cost to being incivil, being confrontational, or being provocative. And so until that changes, don't expect it to go away. The second point is on the communications issue. We've witnessed over the last couple of decades an outright revolution that I think has exacerbated the polarization of political views in the country. The ease with which anybody can get their voice out there and message and network, the anonymity of the internet. I think what's happened over the last couple of decades is there's been an opening of an enormous number of spaces out there to express yourself politically, and I think that these spaces have quickly become, in many cases, echo chambers where you see a lot of framing, very hard framing and filtering of information that reinforce a number of worldviews. And ultimately, again, if you want to capture market share either as a cable TV channel or you want to get traffic on your blog, be confrontational, be provocative, don't be boring. And so I think the internet and modern communications technology certainly has exacerbated some of the stuff. We're just going to have to learn how to work with it because we're not going to go backwards, I think, from a technological standpoint. The final point that I wanted to make has to do with referees and mediators. Politics is a full contact sport, and try to imagine playing hockey with some brutes, and you don't have any referees, in the game. And so I think one of the things that disturbs me a bit, I see it a lot of polling data right now. Not only the referees or mediators, but just information sources, levels of trust, broad-based trust across the political spectrum in institutions or entities that traditionally have been viewed as credible and trustworthy. It's really low right now. And so the media, mainstream media, government, scientific community, right now the trust numbers for these entities and institutions are quite low. I think the primary reason for that has been that a lot of these entities have been a strategic political target. That might be lamentable or sad, but in a way it's effective. And so the entities have been targeted, and trust has been undermined from a strategic perspective. Some of the big hockey teams, they don't want a referee, so take them out of the game. And I think a secondary cause or secondary reason lies within the institutions themselves. I think often, maybe more so on the government side or on the scientific community side, which I work with both as a social scientist but also traditional physical scientist, they often view credibility and trust as an entitlement that sort of comes with their credentials, when in fact I kind of look at it as more of an earned asset that needs to be cultivated and protected. And these institutions are not above reproach at all. And they make mistakes, and I think those mistakes usually get amplified, and that sort of contributes to the undermining of trust. And so I think the reaction to that, would be they've got to work a little bit harder, and also we might look as a community collectively to trying to build some of the better capacity in institutions, even if they're NGOs or some other types of entities that you broadly trust them and view them as credible in terms of setting the parameters for debate, not necessarily telling you where you should end up in terms of what you want to do. So I'll stop there and leave time for my next guest. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Chris Willey, editorial page editor for the Bradenton Herald.
Thank you, Ed. Like Ed was saying, I believe political incivility has been around for a very long time. I think it first started with the cavemen when they determined tribal leadership with a club. Today our clubs are a little bit different. They're the internet, social networking, and various television outlets that cater to a highly partisan audience. But when you witness some of these episodes of incivility, some of them are just appalling, and I think it's gotten worse over the past 2 decades, a lot of it because of the internet, but also because of other reasons. One recent example of incivility was a testy exchange during a congressional hearing between Representative Don Young of Alaska and historian Doug Brinkley, in which Young mistakenly identified Brinkley as Dr. Rice. Brinkley took umbrage, but was told by Young immediately, "I can call you anything I want when you're sitting in that chair." To which Brinkley replied simply, "Pardon?" Young then doubled down and said, "You just be quiet, just be quiet." Well, Brinkley quickly retorted, "You don't own me, I pay your salary." Finally, somebody else on that congressional committee had to interrupt and tell everybody to calm down. But those kind of exchanges are all too common nowadays. Last week, Hardball examined the idea that Congress is broken because of the disappearance of moderates, much of what Dan was talking about. I'm going to expound on that. I'll take that one step further. The disappearance of moderates is increasing the political incivility as rigid ideology on the right and left leave no middle ground, and therefore there's no room for compromise and moderates. PolitiFact.com fact-checked a batch of chain emails that circulate like wildfire on the internet and found that almost always they're false. And yet people embrace them for partisan reasons, and the echo chamber just gets louder and louder. Getting back to the disappearance of moderates, the National Journal Daily and CBS News put out annual studies of congressional voting records. In 1982, the Senate had 60 moderates among both parties. That number dropped to 36 after the '94 midterm elections, then fell to 9 after 2002. After the 2010 election, there was not a single moderate in the Senate. Politicians today are not talking to the other side, they're yelling and screaming instead. There doesn't seem to be any room for compromise, as witnessed by the recent failure of the supercommittee. And as Dan was saying, they're only talking to their own people because they know if they win in the primary, they're likely to win in the general. The largest group of voters today are independents, but politicians don't have to address those moderates because they're really running in the primary. So politicians speak to their highly partisan voters, while moderates are left with the choices in the general election in the middle, stuck in the middle between two sides, two extreme sides. One example of a moderate here in Florida who fell prey to that was Charlie Crist, who got drummed out of the Florida Republican Party for his moderate positions, losing out to Tea Party favorite Marco Rubio. Unfortunately, the public is no better than the politicians in exhibiting boorish behavior over politics. When First Lady Michelle Obama and Jill Biden were introduced at Homestead Miami Speedway in November during NASCAR's final race of the season, the crowd just rained boos and jeers on them. The two women were there to honor military families, and why the crowd would resort to such incivility is beyond me. But it appears to control the national debate, and fortunately, we're on the local level, it doesn't dominate the debate, and that's a good thing. Certainly it comes up, and as the Bradenton Herald hopes to do, we've embarked on a series of articles on civility and politics, and we'll continue to to push civility in politics, because we believe that's very important. While a majority of the American public also believe that, unfortunately, they're not exhibiting that in their behavior. We'll keep reminding the public, too, to take civility heart, else this country descend further into incivility. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Richard O'Brien. Richard's the chairman of the Manatee County Democratic Party.
Thank you. A recent survey held across the nation showed that 95% of Americans believe that civility is important to a healthy democracy, and I think most of us can agree that's a good idea. We like to be respected as individuals. We like our leaders to be respect-worthy and to act in a respectable manner. But it's as much human nature to be kind as it is to be mean, as it's much human nature to be criminal as much as to be saintly. The meanness that's part of politics is part of politics because it's part of human nature. It goes back to the Founding Fathers, and Congressman Miller spoke articulately, and Ed Childs gave some great examples of historical examples of how meanness has been in politics hundreds of years, and I would say thousands. Andrew Jackson's wife was hounded by the media and the opposition so severely that she died from it. That's mean. Just 15 years ago, and this is something that one of the other speakers alluded to, Ted Kennedy and Alan Simpson could sit down after vicious elections were over, and they could sit down and hash out a budget that made sense for the interest of the country. That doesn't exist anymore. Those days are gone. Respectable men and women sitting down to do the business of the nation. Now, unless you're going to change human nature overnight, I believe you need to borrow a page from the book of the Founding Fathers, and you need to create some checks and balances to help solve this issue. And it is an issue that we should be concerned with. I would recommend a few steps. One of them is attack ads are so pervasive and are so destructive and drown out so much of the important political discourse that should happen that the 527s and the 501c4s, the nonprofits that are allowed to weigh into political issues under certain guises, they should be banished. They should not be part of the political landscape. Because there are protections afforded the people behind those organizations that allows them to attack and destroy candidates without consequences for their actions. And their names are only available oftentimes after the election. The second thing I would say, and this is, I guess, a little radical, I think there should be a public finance option in politics. Take the unions out, take the corporations out, take individual donations out, have a $10 to $20 fee across the nation for every American, and have every candidate from dog catcher up to the president funded from a public fund. Take the corporations, take everybody out, except for those people that are willing to do the legwork, gather the signatures to run, and get a percentage of whatever is out there in a public fund. It's a radical idea, but I tell you, I don't know how we get our democracy back without getting the undue influence of corporations out, the undue necessity for congressmen to start fundraising the day after they're elected. That the doors are much more open to lobbyists that represent things that usually don't represent average people's concerns than they are to you is a failing of our democracy and a failing of us not to correct it. And the last thing I would say is that we need to tighten our election slander and libel laws. There is so much slander and libel that occurs via the internet, via the TV, via radio, that's unanswered because the laws aren't strict enough. Now, Great Britain had some tough laws for a few years there that literally could lead to incarceration and massive fines. I think we should take a page out of that book because good, honest people are being absolutely eviscerated by this culture of attack. And there's so much better and so much more that we can aspire to be.
And now we'll hear from David Agee. David is the Manatee Republican State Committeeman.
Well, we're talking about political incivility, and I think we need to define it. The Greek, basically politics is a Greek word, and it derives from the Greek root poly, meaning many, and ticks, who are blood-sucking creatures. Now, seriously, though, I do think we need to have a definition, and Merriam-Webster defines civility as a polite act or expression or civilized conduct, especially courtesy and politeness. And I'm here to tell you, civil politics is an oxymoron and a myth. I believe that if you can go back to our founding, and you've heard Ed and some other folks talk about it, we've never been a civil society in the definition of courtesy towards a political opponent. I should say, we have made improvements, though. We outlawed dueling in 1839. Now, consider this headline. State customs officer and tax collector, a close relative of the lieutenant governor, was hung in effigy in a public park. Could have been Zuccotti Park. The large drunken mob marched the effigy to his house, where they proceeded to behead the effigy and burn it. And when they were done burning the effigy, they set his house on fire. Now, does anybody know when that occurred? That actually occurred in 1765. And it was one of the chain of, quote, civil events that led to the American Revolution. And the perpetrators of that particular breach of public peace were referred to as the Sons of Liberty by Sam Adams and John Adams. Now, I'm pretty sure Andrew Oliver, who was a tax collector, didn't feel that politics were very civil at that point in time. Then we can consider the case of the election of 1800. In 1800, President Adams was seeking re-election, and Thomas Jefferson was his opponent. Jefferson hired the very first political consultant, James Callender. James Callender characterized President Adams as follows. Adams is a hideous, hermaphroditical character who has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Adams returned the civil favor by claiming that Thomas Jefferson was the illegitimate son of a half-breed Indian squaw sired by a Virginian mulatto. Now the absolute most interesting thing about that election is that Jefferson won. Now, he won because he painted Adams as a warmonger and who wanted to start a war with France. Now, that was all well and good, but it was a complete fabrication, a complete lie. And he won the election on it, which I think goes back to the point that our Democrat colleague made, which is there is a problem in politics in the sense that people can say things and there's no repercussions. But are we civil in politics? I'd answer no. Now, someone already alluded to the fight between Sumner Brooks, basically Senator Sumner and Preston Brooks. I won't go into that unless somebody wants me to. But do you realize that in 1860, they commonly referred to Abraham Lincoln as a long-haired, hairy ape of a man? And he was depicted that way in cartoons and in the press. Martin Van Buren was accused of wearing women's corsets by Davy Crockett. James Buchanan, who's president, had a crook in his neck. And so the rumors that went around were that he had tried to unsuccessfully hang himself. and this is not limited to the 17th century, the 18th century. FDR called Alf Landon, who was his 1936 opponent. He said he was the white mouse that wants to live in the White House. Tip O'Neill in the 80s would commonly refer to Ronald Reagan as the most ignorant man who ever occupied the White House. And Reagan, in return, compared O'Neill in a speech to a classic arcade game, Pac-Man, saying that Tip was a round little thing that gobbled up money. And you know, so I think the point, though, is that this sort of stuff has gone on, and I mean, I can cite examples most recently as 2004 or even Labor Day where some very vicious things were said. But I think the point you should take from today is that it's always been that way. There's nothing that's really changed about that. And I mean, if you just look at the example of Paul Ryan, who proposed a very modest budget cut, $4 trillion over 10 years. We have a $15 trillion deficit in this country, and he was proposing 10 years to just shave $4 trillion off. And he was demonized by Democrats with internet videos showing him as a look-alike pushing grandma off a cliff. Now, I really believe that calls for civility, while they may be well-meaning, are naive. Politics, as I said, and as I've illustrated, have never been civil in the United States or courteous. It's a reflection of the society around us, and let's face it, there's discourteous people in society around us. But more importantly, if civility won elections, you can be rest assured that politicians would be the most civil people on the face of the planet. And a cynic might conclude that calls for civility seem most strident from the side that lost the most recent election. But in closing, I just want to point out one thing. When we call for civility, I think it's a dangerous issue in some ways, because when society becomes more interested in civility than freedom of speech, then freedom itself becomes the victim. And this sort of victimhood, this sort of thing is happening in Europe today. Free speech is under attack. It's come under the guise of eliminating hate speech and making society civil. An example of how this has backfired, in 2009, Geert Wilders, who was a sitting member of Dutch Parliament, was prosecuted for incitement to hatred and discrimination for criticizing Islam. All he did was put up a video and say, this is what the Quran says, here's some acts of Islamic violence. Now, he was ultimately acquitted after a very expensive trial. And it's not limited to the Netherlands. Elizabeth Sabdish-Wolff, who was an Austrian housewife, was found guilty in Austria of engaging in hate speech by denigrating religious teachings of a legally recognized religion. She said that Muhammad was a pedophile based on the fact that he married a 9-year-old, and the court actually said, well, yeah, he married a 9-year-old, but we can't say if that's pedophilia, and you've denigrated a religion, so therefore you need to be fined. And so I would caution this body, when we consider about civility, because I do believe that there is an issue with personal attacks, but they're effective. We have to be careful, because civility truly is in the eye of the beholder, because if we go back to that definition, the definition of civility is it's community. Give me one moment here. It's civilized conduct or politeness, and that definition has changed over the years. You know, example by the fact that we used to shoot each other if we were offended, and today we just yell insults at each other. So thank you very much.
We'll now take questions from Tiger Bay members. If you've got a question, please step up to the microphone right here, and please keep your questions brief, and identify yourself. Marianne.
Good afternoon, Marianne Barnaby. My question, I guess, would be directed at Chris, but I would be interested if the others would care to weigh in. And it's a two-part question. One is, when we are looking at the paper and we look at our letters to the editor, we know those letters to the editor have been vetted and people have to sign their name. And I know that there's ways to get around that, but I think that you work very hard to make sure that the letter is indeed written by the person who says they wrote it. When you contrast and compare that with the internet blogs, where people can say and do anything, slander anyone, make comments about people's children, marriage, what have you, I'm just wondering where that enters into the civil discourse and the civility of political discussion. And part B is, some newspapers, including members of the New York Times group, have changed their policy and will only allow people to blog in if they identify themselves correctly. Do you see our community going to that?
Unlike some other notipapers, even some other newspapers in the region, we telephone every letter writer to make sure that they wrote that letter. A lot of other newspapers don't do that. It is time consuming, but we feel it's valuable, and we have caught some letters that the person we contact say, no, I did not write that. So that's a valuable backstop. As far as you know, fact-checking all those letters, that's, you know, for our small staff, that's an impossibility. But if there's something in there that I suspect is false, I'll try to check it on the internet or other sources to make sure that it's factually correct. I can't do that with every letter. I just don't have the time. As far as commenting on our internet site and the anonymity of that is widespread in the industry. We're not the only newspaper that does that. Some newspapers are requiring people to either register or comment via their Facebook page so that they are easily identifiable. And that does create a more civil conversation. You're absolutely right. And I'm a member of a McClatchy editorial page editors group that has been discussing this issue. And it's a very difficult one because then you're talking about reducing internet access, and the internet was born out of that exact thing, anonymity, that people can talk and have a conversation and still remain hidden. So it's something that's the industry is grappling with, and there's no easy answer. And as far as McClatchy is concerned, we're not heading in that direction as a corporation, but we're discussing it. It's just a difficult thing to cut people off.
One thing I'd add to that is that you had penny. Excuse me, microphone. Throughout the 19th century, you had penny papers, they were called, and they were so cheap to produce. People would call people names and do terrible things, rumors and whatnot. So that hasn't changed. And as to anonymity, our founding fathers wrote with pseudonyms. So I mean, I don't know that the answer is to cut down on anonymity, because the reality is that if you're anonymous or not, people are going to say things. So that's what I add.
Richard?
You know, we're seeing this emergence of a new media. The internet is one of the greatest tools for increasing democracy in the world today. I mean, the Facebook revolution in Egypt is an example, and there are several other places where the amount of discussion and public discourse that happens on the internet and some of the transparency that goes with it makes it a good tool. The other part of it, which is negative, is the attacks that can occur and the falsehoods that can occur anonymously, which we're discussing. Because it is a emerging media, Google and the other search engines are trying to catch up and find ways of taking things down as quickly as possible once an issue is raised. But that's something that they're playing catch up on. So, you know, it is an excellent tool, but the search engines themselves need to be very attuned to the needs of people that are being slandered and maligned.
I'd like to add one thing. There is one aspect of our website where you can look at a comment and there's a button you can hit that says offense. And when it reaches a certain threshold, that comment is removed from the website. So there is recourse on comments.
Next question. Doctor?
I'm Jim Rogers. I'm a Tiger Bay member. And I've heard Dan Miller speak on numerous occasions, and again, about the issue of our system whereby in the primary part of the election process, you have to appeal to the extremes of the party in order to make it through the primary, and then you go running to the center in the general election. And to me, this is a negative process. And my question is, I'm a moderate and I'm an independent, and I can't vote in the primaries. So what's wrong with an open primary in this conversation?
Who would you like to address that to?
Just the group in general. I know the individual party chairman will have strong opinions.
Frank, you want to start?
There's nothing wrong with an open primary. You're going to add a little bit more volatility and I think less control that each political party has over its preferred candidate. And so you might get some folks that don't like that, but is there anything wrong with an open primary? Not at all.
Let's see if anybody up here wants to take the other side of that question.
There are some open primaries in the country. Louisiana does open primaries. Does New Hampshire open primaries? So there are some states that have it.
Maybe 18 states that have open primaries.
Right. But what happens a lot of times is the two most, if in a conservative area like in Louisiana, maybe just two Republicans get in the runoff. You just need to get 50% of the vote, and you don't even have it. But it's still done at a primary date rather than a November election. So the people that participate is not the moderates that participate in those elections. So they've tried it, and there's nothing wrong with it. But one thing about the two-party system, a lot of people criticize the two-party system. I think it's a good system. We're unique in this country. We only have two parties. But campaign finance laws changed a few years ago that has weakened the parties. And, said, let's get the money out of the parties and all this soft money. So they banned soft money. So where's all the soft money going now? Super PACs. This year, there's going to be a multi-billion-dollar campaign going on with super PAC money. That people can write million-dollar checks, multi-million-dollar checks. Both sides will have the money, and it's going to be all negative money. This is going to be the most negative campaign we've ever had. So you start changing a law, and you always got to deal with the First Amendment issues, and the end result is not always what you want. So I think a two-party system, and I'm not, I'm not a strong party person, but I like the two-party system.
Two points. First of all, we don't really just have a two-party system in the country. There are numerous different political parties. But secondly, it would be as if someone said, I want to come into the Tiger Bay Club and determine who your board is, but I don't want to pay the dues. I don't want to be a member. I don't want to be a member of the Tiger Bay Club. I just want to be able to control who's in charge of your board. And so it's the same concept when it comes to political parties. There are people there who have created an organization, an association, and they should have a right to choose who their candidate's going to be. Now, there's nothing that says if you don't like those candidates, start your own party. We don't have to have a two-party system in this country.
Carol Whitmore, and I'm a member, and for all of you that do not know, but I'm sure you all do, I'm a moderate Republican. I've been a politician for 20 years. I've been elected every time. I agree, unfortunately, you're either far right or far left. But actually, when you get in behind the polls, you usually go for the moderate or somebody that can fit you in your mold. The county commission has had to get their bias bulletproofed. I have somebody that was up there stalking me today. We've had threats. I mean, it's very, very scary to be a politician. But if you have it in your heart, you want to do it. My question is for you guys is, I know I heard your comments that you can't be a respectful politician. Well, all of you all have known me. You've known Mike Bennett. I can't think that anybody would think that I'm anything but a respectful politician and very successful. So I don't agree with that. So I'd like to hear your comments on why you think somebody that actually has some morals and has a little bit of class and respect for my fellow citizens can't be a successful politician.
Yeah, we've known each other for a long time. Carol, when we were in the hospital, when I was chairman of the board in the 1980s. And I was never in politics. I ran for Congress, as most of you know. And I said I'd stay 10 years, and I retired after 10 years. You know, the majority of the people, the overwhelming majority of the people in Congress are good, respectable people. And I think, you know, the people in the state legislature would say that's true of the people in Tallahassee, too. So it's not like you can't have good, respectable people there. But you have some losers. You mentioned one, Don Young. I mean, there's a name. He's a guy from Alaska. That guy's obnoxious. He's a Republican. I remember telling a story about Don Young. I remember when I first got elected in '92, you're looking for a committee to go on, and he was the top Republican on the Natural Resources Committee. And so I thought, well, that might be interesting. I went and talked to him about, you know, the committee, includes the National Park Service and such. And he said, well, first of all, you're from Florida, and either you're going to commit to vote with me 100% of the way, or I don't want anything to do with you. I'm a Republican. I mean, this guy's obnoxious to Republicans, let alone to anyone else. So you get some, people that you're embarrassed to have, and they're in both parties. And so they make a bad name for the rest of them. But I think most people are good, honorable people that serve for the right reasons.
Mona Jane. My question is that each one of you did a great job, and we talked about open primaries. My question is, can we cut down this to a month or a 2 month of campaigning only? Are we looking at it? At least that, because other countries do it, so maybe that will be one way of cutting down all this.
David shaking his head.
Sure.
And I mean, I share your frustration because, it seems the longer the process goes on, the more dirt gets slung around. But the downside, if it's a very short period, you may not really get to know a candidate. And so the result is you get essentially the Manchurian candidate, somebody who you think is one thing because you've had a bunch of media, the echo chamber saying, oh, this guy's great or this woman's great, and it turns out they're not who they said they were. So I mean, I think the answer is not necessarily restricting speech. The answer is more speech. And I think that would solve it. But I think one of the biggest mistakes our country made was there was a New York Times, a lawsuit, the Supreme Court heard it. And essentially what it said is that a newspaper or media outlet has no obligation to be truthful unless you can prove that organization was intentionally malicious. Then you have no cause of action, no remedy, and they can print lies. And I think that was a mistake in our jurisprudence.
question again is, I won't take time to reply to that. I have connection in lot of countries, and they say, what is this zoo business going on, America? I love this country. We are proud of our country. But the way things go, that people do not turn on their TVs because each channel is talking the same thing.
The information is out there. I think it comes back to this. You're not going to find a solution in government. You're not going to find a solution from a newspaper. You're going to find a solution because you have to strain out you have to strain out what's false and what's not. And it's your job as an American to do that, because there's all sorts of information out there, and it's really your job to pick and choose and figure it out.
But we have all kind of citizens, and we confuse them more than anything else.
I'm not sure if this answers the question, but in terms of, I sort of smirked when I heard a fixed period on campaign season. Campaign season is 24. It never ends, and that's one of the things that I had just scribbled down. I think that I'd like to distinguish between is elections and then governing after the elections are over. I think there's certainly a long history of incivility in political election that goes back the entire history of our country. And a lot of what was said 200 years ago may even be more vitriolic than what we're hearing now. But for me, is there anything different? Has anything changed? For me, I think, yeah, it might not be that the incivility in the elections process has changed, but our ability to just govern in a responsible way seems to be hampered. It seems to be paralyzed, I think. So what's different between now and 20 years ago? We're in a really deep hole right now. And I think 20 years ago, folks, when you came back from Congress, they really didn't care if the road out of the hole leaded a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left. Just get me out of the hole. I think right now what's happening is people are coming back. The Congress folks, they're hearing from their constituents, and it's not like get me out of the hole. It's like, don't you dare think about the left road. We're going right and right only. And the other, don't you dare think about the right fork. We're going to the left. And I think that might be reflective of a polarized political electorate and some of the stuff that we've been talking about. So I do, my problem is not how nasty that the comments are or what you need to do to win an election. My problem tends to be that after the election's over, we're not really governing all that well right now. It's not that hard. Can we solve our debt problem and get ourselves out of the recession at the same time? Can you chew gum and walk at the same time? And it's just been very difficult for our Congress and our government right now to do that. So.
Richard, briefly, and then we'll move on to the next question.
So most of us are familiar with Citizens United versus FEC, which a lot of people think is the single worst Supreme Court decision in generations. Sandra Day O'Connor said wistfully that she would not have retired from the Supreme Court had she known the way that was going to go. And it really has put corporations in a situation where not only do they have their voice heard, but they're like super citizens. The perpetual campaign that the doctor is talking about, I think, is a problem. I mean, here in local city politics, 3-4 months, that's a typical campaign, gears up about 3-4 months before that. County, it's better part, 6 months, sometimes a year out. But the perpetual campaign at the national level is unhealthy. And part of the reason for the polarization, part of the reason for this, the fact that we were talking about earlier, that a congressman on his first day, it might not be the same as when Congressman Miller was in office, but the first day they've got to start raising money, and it's the number one thing that a congressperson does is raise money, and that's wrong. So I believe the doctor that spoke and asked the question has it right, and we have to change the campaign finance laws. I believe taking the corporations and the unions. Listen, I'm a Democrat. I love that the unions are in there giving money to Democrats, but you need to take everybody out, publicly finance it so that everybody gets a fair shot at it. And you know what? Whoever hustles harder, whoever works harder, whoever has a better message with the same amount of money, maybe they ought to be the person elected.
I'm Rusty Russell, and I'm a member. And, it all comes back to the almighty dollar. Now, I spent half my life in the radio broadcasting business, owning and operating radio stations. I spent the second half of my life working with the newspapers here at the Bradenton Herald. And I guarantee you that when election season comes along, we say, all hail the mighty dollar, because we're going to make our budget this month. So it's a question of what we can do about finance laws. Can we cut out the corporations? Can we cut out the unions? Can we cut out the people who want to write a check for $1 million? Maybe we could put a limit on it. I don't know what the but the question is, what can we do about campaign financing so it will not go on for a year? It maybe could cut down for 2 months.
You want to direct that to anybody in particular? Or?
No, just to the panel in general.
Dan, you want to pick that up?
It's a short answer, amend the Constitution of the United States. I mean, the freedom of speech is money. The Supreme Court's ruled you can spend money. You can't restrict it unless you change the First Amendment of our Constitution. If you're in the media, you want to play around with the Freedom of Speech Amendment? You know, that's a risky thing. I don't like the money. Most people, don't like the money. But the bottom line is money is free speech. And so you start restricting the amount of time, Mona, that's limiting freedom of speech. Now, we're not a parliamentary form of government. In some ways, we have moved towards a parliamentary form in a way because the parties have become much more homogeneous themselves. But the bottom line is money is free speech, and you start changing that, you're affecting the First Amendment of our Constitution. So sadly, that's hard to do.
One point of personal privilege, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was a 5-4 decision. Is that correct?
Yeah. It was, 5-4 decision.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm Lori Dorman, and I'm a member. And this is actually directed to Frank Alcock. What happens if we have term limits? I know that requires a constitutional amendment, but how is that going to affect how politics works in the United States?
Term limits. Gee, I just did a Tiger Bay down in Sarasota on term limits. Let me not give the hour-and-a-half answer, but try to give the shorter version. If you were to pass a constitutional amendment such that you had term limits, I think on the positive side, you have greater turnover in the offices that are term limited. So this idea that you would have new blood, fresher thinking, you score some points over there. What you do lose is you lose a good amount of experience in terms of working through a system and getting things done. You don't necessarily get away from the career politicians because they tend to hop around a lot, and that's what we've seen in states that actually have term limits. So it's that, I think that's that trade-off between if everybody wants the person in office that they don't like to be term limited out, and then if somebody that they like, they don't want them to be term limited out. So the impact on governance for me, it's questionable. I really didn't take a strong side in that Tiger Bay. I think it's a trade-off. You're going to have greater turnover, and you might get some fresh faces and more opportunities for people to step into to offices, but you tend to see a little bit of a merry-go-round in terms of their career politicians, and you do lose some experience, whether you view that as a positive thing or a negative thing.
Richard?
Just one follow-up question, if I may. One of the things that we've heard today from the speakers is that the minute you walk into office, you start campaigning again. If there's a term limitation, does that force people to actually focus on governing rather than campaigning if they don't get to stay in office indefinitely?
The impacts that term limits have on the financing mechanism and the influence that you see between special interests, however you want to define them, and the politicians, I think there's a little bit of an interesting trade-off. If you put in place term limits, some of those longer-term established connections between politicians or office holders and their quote-unquote favored or preferred special interests are disrupted, and many folks view that as a positive thing. On the flip side, though, with respect to getting back to that point about experience, often what you do is you take people that have been in office for a while that have a sound understanding of both issues and the process of governing, and you replace them with people that know far less than the lobbyists do. And so suddenly you create a condition where the lobbyists in certain ways have a lot more influence than they did under a system that didn't have term limits. So it's kind of a trade-off, and the net impact, I can't give you a clear answer, whether it's a positive or a negative thing.
Richard, you want to take this one?
So I know I'm going to get in trouble with my wife for this, but my wife, Ani, who's in the audience in the back, pregnant with twins, a boy and a girl, we just found out yesterday. So they started doing these 99% protests right smack in front of my wife's bank, Bank of America. And, you know, I'm a liberal. I'm not ashamed to say it. I'm glad when people get out there and they're expressing themselves and trying to get involved in their democracy. It doesn't matter what side they're on. But I had mixed feelings because this is my wife's bank. So I snuck over to it, and I kind of interviewed a few people to try to figure out what it was about, you know, what their grievances were. And there was a young lady named Jasmine Bowman. And she's a mother. She's finding it hard to raise her kids, you know, can't find a good job. And she said something that I found was interesting. She said, I don't begrudge the wealthy their wealth. She goes, but I just don't want the wealthy to be able to buy more democracy than anyone else. And I think there's something legitimate in that. And there's something legitimate with corporations being able to buy more democracy. We all know that when you go to court, if you can afford a good lawyer, you get a little cut of extra democracy because, the court system is designed that money helps. But when it comes down to it, when your money equates to freedom of speech, I don't think that is right. I don't think that it's right when your money and your freedom of speech can drown out all other speech. That, I think, is a problem.
I'm Tom Nolan. I am a member. We've talked about two different things today. One is the polarization that's happening in government and civility or incivility. Those are two different things, and civility and incivility has not caused the polarization. That has been caused by something else. And I think maybe Tiger Bay ought to address a program that has to do with polarization as opposed to civility and incivility. Let me say that the truthfulness doesn't just happen on the candidate side or untruthfulness. A few years ago, the New York Times did a study and found that candidates committed as many untruths about themselves as negative campaigning did on the candidates. So it happens on both sides of that equation. What I'd like to ask you, however, is about the difference between negative and compare and contrast, because there is a difference. And what is it? What do you see it as? I have a definition myself. I'll let me see what you all say. What's negative and what's compare and contrast? No, the panel as a whole.
And I think that's a very good point, because the problem is that I believe Michelle Obama said that the Republicans wanted to poison our waters and destroy our air. From her perspective, it was a valid characterization, and if you talk to a Republican probably said she's attacking me personally. And I think that the difference is if you can support what you're saying with facts, then it's no longer just a negative attack. It's something supportable. But something I miss in politics, especially on the national level, it doesn't seem that people speak in facts and figures as much anymore. And I do think that's an issue. But I also would point out that polarization has happened in our country over and over again, and it's really because we're faced with an issue that the country is wrestling with right now. It's a question of, the Democrats have a certain way that they feel the country should go, which would be more government, and Republicans, at least the ones I identify, would say, no, government should be limited and there should be less of it. And there's a divide in the country. We haven't made our minds up collectively as a society. And you saw the same sort of really negative, what happened between Sumner and when he was beaten, it was a fight over slavery. He'd called a Southern senator a pimp. And he got beaten up for it, but the whole country was polarized. And so I think that you see these happen because we haven't figured it out. We're still wrestling with it.
I want to thank the panel. I think it was a lively discussion. I want to thank all of those members that asked questions. It was my privilege to be here today as your guest moderator. Hugh, Chef, thank you for the meal. I thought the gravy was excellent, as was the turkey. Sweet potatoes, nice crunch on them, creamy, really, really nice job on that. Beans were a little crispy for me, but I'm a Southern boy, so I like them a little bit more well done. Please remember to tell your friends and your colleagues about Tiger Bay. This is a great organization that's in its just getting started here, and to be a strong organization, we need all of your help. So please encourage others to come, attend regularly. and encourage others to do so as well. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.